Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, a podcast series brought to you by Monocle Solutions, where we delve into the dynamic world of banking. I'm your host, Michael Avery. Great to be back with you. And in this series, we're exploring the evolving landscape of banking. We're tracing the roots of fractional reserve banking, the rise of the all-powerful central bankers, from the booms and the busts of the cycles, from bank loans to bank runs, from old-school vaults to virtual wallets, and the ever-increasing rise of bank regulation and its impact on local South African financial institutions. So whether you're a banking professional, a financial enthusiast, or just someone who simply wants to stay informed about the world of finance, you're in the right place. Well, welcome to the third episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. And whenever I talk to the various market commentators on my radio show, one thing more than any other dominates how they view the future for stocks and bonds, and in fact all asset classes really, and that is the Fed, and whether inflation is now structurally higher, and whether interest rates too will have to settle at much higher levels than what was considered the new normal after the global financial crisis of close to zero interest rates in the developed world. Hell, the Austrians issued a 100-year SARB bond, which was heavily oversubscribed at the height of that, and we've certainly seen a lot of that unwind over the last 12 months. We've seen South Africa's government bond yield soaring, with the interest burden crowding out other important spending, as was recently alluded to by the finance minister in his mini budget. Pretty soon we're going to be spending around 22 cents of every rand collected in revenue, in taxes, servicing our national debt. So just think about that as we dive into this next discussion. Lots to discuss with my guest today, Professor Brian Kantor, an economist, former chief investment strategist of Investec Wealth and Investment. He's a Professor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town, where he was the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce and Head of the School of Economics. He's the previous non-executive chairman of AccuCap Properties and also the founding chairman of the V&A Waterfront. And Brian, you hold both your degrees as well from UCT, a BCom and a BA honours. And speaking of that institution, it grew from your old school, SACS, which is certainly steeped in history and tradition, given its link to the Springboks as well. It gave Western Province its blue hoops, I believe, and great to have you on the podcast. Firstly, what did you think of the Boks going back to back, given your alma mater is one of the key feeders of the Springboks over the years?
Yes, SACS, South African College School, amalgamated with what was the University of Cape Town in the early 1900s. So the university adopted the SACS hoops. Remember, South African College School. So the school was part of a college that awarded degrees through what was the university, I think it was called the University of the Cape of Good Hope, which was the examining authority. 1829. Well,
there's a bit of history for you on a podcast where we like to go into history. Yeah.
Yes. The school was worth mentioning, the school was in town. It was an inner city school. And we lived in Oranjezerk. And the school was down the road. It was an inner city school with a strong representation of Jewish students, of whom I was one, who lived in the area, and gave the school some of its character. In fact, in the 30s, the best boxers at the school were the Jewish boys. Later, it became the St. John's Orphanage boys who were the good boxers. And the one sport we always beat bishops at was boxing, because we were a pretty tough crowd. Anyway.
Well, it's that...
Digression.
It's that digression that informs, I think, to some extent, where we find ourselves in markets today, because you might get a bit of a bloodied nose or lead with the chin if you try and fight the Fed, as many of my market commentators refer to on my show. And it seems to be the only game in town, and we'll bring it back to how it affects us here in South Africa in a while. But firstly, I think just to establish some basics here, Brian, it's very important just to understand the basics of inflation, because we all are desperate to understand what is driving this inflation, supply-demand dynamics, post-COVID, was it supply chain issues? There's been lots of money printing, all that kind of thing, because it will ultimately inform where interest rates go and where the cost of capital goes. So can you just elaborate on how you see the supply and demand dynamics influencing our inflation that we're experiencing today? Because it certainly isn't the transient school that we thought a couple of years ago. It seems to be a lot stickier.
No, central banks thought it was transitory. And they were wrong, because they didn't appreciate the role that money plays in causing prices to rise. So let's start with the definition of inflation. So it's continuous rise in prices. It's not one-off, it's continuous. And then you would add caused. If you followed Milton Friedman, you say caused by an excess in the supply of money over the demand to hold that money. And then you say, well, where does money come from? Well, in the old days, there were strict limits on the supply of money that governments and central banks could provide, and that was the convertibility requirement. Your money had to be converted on demand into gold. So you had to have gold reserves, and that limited your ability to create money, because it had to be backed in a very fractional way. But that if the customers of banks or the people who own the notes wanted gold, they could get gold. Now that all broke down in the 1970s. The link with gold and the restraint on the supply of money imposed by a convertibility requirement fell away at the choice of the Americans. Americans didn't ask anybody. They just decided they would no longer convert dollars into gold on the request of central banks, which was the system that had been imposed by the Bretton Woods, the post-war reconstruction, which also established the IMF and the World Bank, and a sort of gold standard linked to the all-powerful dollar. And
the Nixon shock
broke down. Yes, it was Nixon and his advisors decided in August 71, against pressure from France in particular. De Gaulle said, yeah, we've got all these dollars, we want gold. And America said, well, no longer, you can't get gold. We'll no longer supply gold. They also did some peculiar things like an incomes policy at the time. But if you think about money, without a convertibility constraint or restraint, governments can print as much money as they like. It doesn't cost anything to print money. So you can create as much of it as seems appropriate in circumstances. And you get inflations when governments print more money than people are willing to hold. And you get hyperinflations when you get extraordinary amounts of money. Well, COVID introduced vast amounts of extra government spending, mostly in the form of direct income relief, funded by printing money, funded in part by printing money. So the U.S. Treasury was writing checks on its account with the Fed and depositing it, and as checks were deposited in household banking accounts in the trillions. And this money, as it usually does, if in excess of the demand to hold that money, it results in more spending on goods, services, and financial assets, and including homes and all sort of objects, data, and so on. So it was classic inflation for the usual money supply reasons, and the central banks somehow were taken by surprise.
That's probably the biggest surprise in all of this, in that the central banks were taken by surprise, because, as you say, this is the classical textbook definition of what happens when you see, money supply increasing. And certainly there was a strong call post the global financial crisis, when we had interest rates artificially low, for modern monetary theory, so to speak, MMT, where if you're the Fed or the world's central bank, backed by the might of the dollar, that you could just print your way out of a crisis without triggering inflation. Well, I think that's disproved that, for one. Could you just elaborate, though, on how inflation expectations affect the willingness of households to hold money, and how this then impacts the broader economy?
Yes, so and we should pay attention to inflationary expectations and its role in the thinking of central banks. But let's start with simply your demand to hold money. Now, inflation happens when the supply of money increases at a faster rate than economic agents are willing to hold that money. Now, the demand for money increases generally with income and wealth. So it's not as if there's a fixed demand for money. Money demand is a function of interest rates and wealth and inflationary expectations. Other things equal, if you expect more inflation, it becomes more expensive to hold what is usually non-interest bearing or low interest bearing money. So in a real sense, your demand for money will fall away as you expect more inflation and you adjust to avoid the loss of purchasing power that inflation will cause. And at an extreme, if you, as in Zimbabwe, very close to us, if you get hyperinflation, well, that will destroy the demand for money, or that money almost completely. People will, in a hyperinflation situation, or even inflation of order of 20, 30% a year, by holding money, you're losing 30 or more percent of that purchasing power every year, and that can accelerate. So when you get hyperinflation, it doesn't last very long. People just give up on holding money.
And then they shift towards using the dollar, for example. Now,
yes, which is probably a good idea. I mean, if I were in Argentina, I would say dollarization is actually one of the ways you'll get out of your permanent, persistent, continuous increases in price. So just go back a step. Shortage of supply can also cause prices to rise. So like the price of any good or service, there's supply forces and their demand forces. But the supply forces are constrained by the real stuff, the real scarcity of resources. On the demand side, you can have unlimited demands depending on how much money governments decide to print. And you can't get persistent increases in prices simply in response to a supply side shock. So less supply, a drought, a flood, a famine will cause prices to rise. But they can't continue to rise unless those price increases are accommodated with more money. And the COVID story is a story of more money, more government spending financed by central banks through quantitative easing, through buying bonds in the market and the like, but accompanied also by a supply side shock. Now, the post-COVID inflation came to an end for the usual reasons. The Fed recognized its mistake, recognized the danger in inflation perpetuating, and slowed down the supply of money and raised interest rates, yes, but the supply of money in the US over the last year has actually fallen, and the supply of bank credit has also fallen. So if you want to know why prices have stopped rising at the rate they were and the rate of inflation is falling away in the US, it's because of a lack of demand. And the lack of demand is linked to the supply of money, which is in retreat.
As Milton Friedman famously stated, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, as you just so succinctly explained. Because, I mean, it makes intuitive sense. If you've got money in circulation chasing a finite number of goods, well, that will then lead to an increase in the price of those goods.
You can create money, but it has a political dimension to it. Remember, why has inflation been brought under control in the US? And the answer fundamentally is because inflation in the US is unpopular. And in fact, it's still unpopular. I mean, one of the reasons why President Biden is not well liked is because prices have risen as much as they have. So ultimately, it's a political issue. How much inflation do you want to tolerate? Well, it depends on its political consequences, because we know what causes inflation. It's too much money. So if you want to control inflation, you have to control the incentive, or you got to restrict the reasons. You got to accept. You got to decide not to print money.
So the decision to target low inflation is ultimately a political one. What are the challenges or the trade-offs then that policymakers face when attempting to balance inflation control with other economic objectives?
So I mean, the recent, as you say, you don't fight the Fed. The Fed is all important, and the Fed has had to act, or believed it important and encouraged to act to reduce inflation back towards the sort of 2% target. And there is a trade-off. If you're going to reduce inflation, having let the inflation genie escape the bottle, now you want to capture it, want to capture the genie. Well, you've got to accept the danger of a recession. In ordinary times, inflation and economic growth will move in the same direction. So you've got an economy running too fast. Inflationary pressures are picking up. You slow down spending. You slow down demand growth by increasing interest rates. I would say also by slowing down the growth in the money supply, and things fall back into line. But there are times, and recent times indicate as much, where you have to give priority to inflation. So the economy is maybe not performing quite as well as it could, but inflation is intolerably high. So you accept as a central bank or as a government that you may have to trade off lower inflation for less growth. So you have to face up to the dangers of slowing it down too rapidly and bringing on a recession. And then the financial markets become very disturbed by these possibilities, as we've seen in America. I mean, the effort to slow down inflation really begins in late 2021. 2022 is a terrible year for the stock and bond markets. I mean, they both lose 20-30% of their index values. And that's coming to terms with the dangers of recession, the impact of rapidly increasing interest rates designed to slow down spending. So inflation, too much demand; less inflation, reduced demand.
So given that, and where we find ourselves at the moment, with the Fed's most recent pause being probably articulated as a somewhat hawkish pause, but the market seems to think that we've reached a peak. The big fear is that interest rates may remain higher for longer. Given what we're seeing with the money supply in the US, that might tend to indicate that inflation could come down maybe slightly quicker than the consensus view in markets. And obviously, wealth is made when you take a position, informed position that goes against the consensus, because that's not where most people are positioned. How do you see the path of interest rates and inflation in the US progressing over the next 12 to 24 months?
The market did fight with the Fed over the outlook for the economy. So the market was concerned, I think, that the Fed had too optimistic a view of the outlook for the economy, and that they would overdo the restrictions, the reduction in spending. Like they would keep interest rates too high for too long. Well, and the market consensus could see recession coming. Hence the slope of the yield curve, so that long-term interest rates were below short-term interest rates, indicating that interest rates would have to come down to make for an equilibrium sort of term structure of interest rates. So the market and the Fed were fighting over the outlook for the economy, a market concern that hence the weakness of the share and bond markets in 2022, that the Fed was overdoing it. It turned out that the U.S. economy has performed surprisingly well, better than consensus of the time. But I think if you look at the market over the last few weeks, particularly last week, it seems quite clear that the U.S. economy, despite an outstanding third quarter, 4%, nearly 5% growth in the third quarter, was slowing down. And that the employment report indicated that pretty clearly. And the thought that the Fed would at least pause became consensus. And we saw the long bond yields coming in quite sharply. So the long end of the bond market had been pushing higher on better economic news and suddenly reversed course. So I think my own sense is that the job of fighting inflation has been won. The war against inflation is pretty much over. The Fed has succeeded, and the pressure on prices on the demand side of the economy has fallen away, and the dangers of slow or even recession have I think somewhat increased. Which it is the case that the American economy's growth slows to pretty much a halt, or barely positive economic growth over the next year or so. The Fed has room to cut interest rates. And that is, again, one of the arguments for raising interest rates in the first instance, so that you can cut them later if needs be. And I think those needs will manifest themselves over the next 12 or to 18 months. So the market is looking ahead, not so much to recession, which I think is pretty much baked in, but to lower interest rates.
There's obviously
it's not the recession that matters, it's the expected recession that matters. That's not so much the level of interest rates, it's where interest rates are heading.
And I want to bring this then back to the Reserve Bank. And, you mentioned the fact that when interest rates rise, you do give yourself as a central bank the cushion to then respond to a downturn in economic growth by reducing interest rates. But we're operating here in South Africa in a very different environment where we've had tepid to no economic growth for some time now, Brian, and we've seen rates move into what seems to be quite restrictive territory. And I know you've been a critic of the Reserve Bank's use of interest rates. How would you like to see the Reserve Bank respond at this particular stage of the cycle to not only ensure that inflation is contained, but to also help with economic growth?
Well, the first point about inflation in South Africa is it can only be contained with exchange rate stability. So you really can't hope to bring inflation down in South Africa unless you have support from the exchange rate and therefore from the prices of imported goods and exported goods. So the variability, the unpredictability of the exchange, the rand, dollar and other exchange rates really makes containing inflation very much more complicated. If you look at the causes of inflation in South Africa over the last few years, it's not too much demand. It's clearly a very restrained demand in South Africa. Spending growth remains under very constrained circumstances, as does supply. But it's impossible to attribute rising prices in South Africa to excess demand. And if you go back to the COVID, the lockdown, South Africa did very little by way of money growth. We didn't do quantitative easing. We didn't do what the major central banks were doing. Yes, we cut interest rates, but if you look at money supply growth in South Africa over the lockdown period, it was very constrained. You could not say that there was too much money pumped into the South African system, and that was responsible for higher prices. So that's my essential argument with the Reserve Bank. They have the task of controlling demand, as has central bank, through appropriate interest rate settings and through, I would add, appropriate consideration of money and bank credit supply trends. And that's their job. Make sure that the demand doesn't run ahead of supply. Well, and that job is pretty much done. In fact, if anything, we've had too little demand. We've also had too little supply. I mean, if you think about the fundamental problems of the South African economy, it's slow growth in supply. And to a limited extent, I would say, the demand side has been under too much restraint rather than too little restraint by way of the policies adopted by the Reserve Bank. So the essential question then is, how do you cope with an unpredictable exchange rate? Because it will have short-term effects on prices.
Yeah.
And my argument is always you really have to ignore it. You can't run monetary policy chasing an exchange rate that is really beyond your influence and control. An exchange rate really reflects global sentiment, risk on, risk off, and the rand is particularly vulnerable to global sentiment. So at the moment, I would say, when the Reserve Bank talks of, as it does, it says we may have to raise interest rates. It just makes no sense to me whatsoever. The last thing the South African economy needs is higher interest rates at this stage. If anything, it needs lower interest rates to encourage a bit of demand in the economy. So that's really the essence of my critique. Now, the Reserve Bank says it always talks about second round effects of inflation. So you have an exchange rate shock that causes prices to rise. And the Reserve Bank thinks that increase in prices will lead to more inflation expected, and therefore higher prices become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy against which they must act. But I think that makes no sense whatsoever. I don't think there's any evidence for self-perpetuating inflation through more inflation expected, because your inflationary expectations, as in the case of America recently, run up against the realities of demand. If the economy doesn't support higher prices, you won't get higher prices. And our economy doesn't support higher prices. There's not enough demand.
Brian, given that and what you've just articulated, clearly it seems you should be filling that vacant position that Kuben Naidu has left for you. But honestly, though, what changes in leadership do you think we need to see at the Reserve Bank to give effect to these policy alternatives that you've just outlined?
Well, I would say people who think a bit more like me. They say, you have to accept reality. You don't react to exchange rates movements. You ignore them in both directions. And you give close consideration to the balance between supply and demand in the economy, and don't disturb that balance. Now, I'm not campaigning for a place on the Monetary Policy Committee. I'm too old for that. But I think the Reserve Bank needs more subtlety in its thinking, and a less instinctively hawkish tone and stance that is really Miss Lessetch's sort of approach. I'm sure every time they vote on interest rates, he votes for a higher one. That doesn't serve South Africa well. Don't react to global moves on interest rates either. You don't try and protect the exchange rate. You have to just let it be and accept that it'll move prices in both directions depending on weaker or higher. But just ignore it and focus on the demand side of the South African economy. Is there too much spending or is there too little spending? That's really the only question you have to answer for yourself. And consistently, I think we've had too little rather than too much.
Well, thanks, Brian. I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Look forward to having you back on next week, where we're going to be looking under the hood. This is more monetary policy. Next week, we're going to be looking under the hood of global banking and discussing bank failures, why banks fail, and the role of central banks and that infamous Fed stress test here on the Monocle Banking Podcast, brought to you by Monocle Solutions. Before we go, I'd like to remind you that if you've got any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to reach out. You can find us on all good podcast platforms. Reach out to me at The Badger on Twitter or email the team at Monocle. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Take care.